The decision, once crystallized in his mind, transformed from burden into inexorable purpose. Magnus descended through the hidden passages of the Pyramid of Photep, each step carrying him further from the light of Prospero's twin moons and deeper into the sanctum, where he would commit his greatest act of love and his most terrible betrayal. The ritual chamber awaited him in the pyramid's heart, a sphere of crystalline perfection, carved from living stone and inscribed with protective wards in languages that predated human civilization. Here, in this place of forbidden communion, he would shatter his father's most sacred edict to save the Imperium itself. The chamber recognized its master's approach, responding to his psychic presence with a subtle shift in temperature and pressure. Ancient mechanisms stirred to life as Magnus entered, runes flickering within a fire along the curved walls. He had designed this sanctum for the deepest mysteries, the most dangerous explorations into the Immaterium's depths. Now it would serve as the stage for his damnation. The irony was not lost on him that this place, built for the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, would witness his transformation from loyal son to unwitting architect of catastrophe. Magnus began the ritual preparations, with movements born of decades of practice, yet his hands trembled with the weight of what he was about to unleash. Each symbol he traced into the chamber floor blazed with psychic fire, the accumulated power of his will made manifest in reality. The air grew thick and oppressive as the barriers between dimensions thinned, frost forming on the crystal walls despite Prospero's warmth above. He could feel entities stirring in the warp's depths, drawn by the beacon of his gathering power like predators scenting blood. Their whispers carried promises and threats in equal measure, but Magnus pushed them aside with practiced discipline. His purpose was pure, his intentions noble. He sought only to warn his father of Horus's treachery. As the ritual circle neared completion, Magnus felt the familiar pull of the Immaterium, that vast ocean of thought and emotion where the laws of physics bent like heated metal. He had navigated these treacherous currents countless times, mapping their shoals and charting their storms. But this journey would be different. This was an act of desperate necessity, a forced entry into forbidden realms, and he knew the entities that dwelt within the warp were ever vigilant, ever hungry for the souls of the unwary. The risks were absolute: madness, possession, the complete dissolution of his consciousness into swirling chaos. Yet the vision of his father, oblivious to the knife poised at his back, drove him forward. With a surge of will that sent tremors through the pyramid's foundations, Magnus launched his consciousness across the void. The journey was a maelstrom of impossible sensations, a kaleidoscope of colors that had no names and sounds that existed only in nightmare. He pushed through the storm of the warp like a crimson spear, driven by singular purpose. Through the chaotic currents, he could perceive Terra's golden light, the imperial palace rising like a mountain of faith and adamantium toward the stars. But between him and his destination lay defenses of such complexity and power that they took his breath away. The emperor had not been idle since the Edict of Nicaea, where once simple psychic wards had protected the palace. Now stood a fortress of pure will, a construction of ancient knowledge that dwarfed even Magnus's considerable abilities. It was beautiful and terrible, a maze of crystalline pathways and geometric impossibilities that seemed to extend into dimensions without names. At its heart, Magnus sensed something that filled him with wonder and growing dread. His father's great work, a project of such ambition that it beggared imagination. Tunnels of living thought stretched across the galaxy, connecting distant worlds in a network that would unite the Imperium as never before. This was the Webway project, the culmination of millennia of planning. The realization struck Magnus like a physical blow. To reach the Emperor, to deliver his warning, he would have to smash through these defenses with all his power. The delicate work of ages would be undone in moments. The Webway project damaged beyond repair. Yet what choice remained? If Horus's rebellion succeeded, if the Emperor fell, then all of humanity's achievements would turn to ash. Better to sacrifice one great work than lose the architect of them all. With a cry that echoed through both material and immaterial realms, Magnus unleashed the full fury of his psychic might against Terra's barriers. The assault was neither subtle nor careful, but a sledgehammer blow delivered with desperate strength. The Emperor's magnificent defenses, wrought with the wisdom of millennia, shattered like glass before hurricane winds. Their destruction sent shockwaves through the warp that would be felt by every psyker in the galaxy, a psychic scream that announced the death of dreams. The Webway tunnels, exposed to chaotic energies by Magnus's assault, began collapsing in cascading failure. Demons poured through the breaches like a tide of malevolence, their inhuman shrieks mingling with the death cries of the dying infrastructure. Magnus watched in mounting horror as his father's great work crumbled, knowing that his desperate attempt to save the Imperium had instead doomed it to eternal dependence on warp travel and the predations of chaos. Through the wreckage of divine architecture, Magnus finally achieved his goal. His consciousness touched that of the Emperor, and for one terrible moment, the two greatest psychers in human history were united in perfect communion. Magnus poured forth his vision of betrayal and civil war, showing the Emperor Horus's corruption and the dark path ahead. He expected understanding, perhaps gratitude despite his violation of the edict. Instead, he felt only cold fury radiating from the golden throne. The Emperor's rage was stellar in its magnitude, a sun going nova in the depths of space. Magnus tried to explain, to justify his actions, but his father's condemnation cut through his words like a blade through silk. The Emperor saw only destruction, the unleashing of demons into the palace's heart, the violation of sacred commands. The warning about Horus was lost in the magnitude of Magnus's transgression, dismissed as desperate fabrication from a son trying to justify betrayal. The psychic link severed with brutal finality, leaving Magnus alone in his ritual chamber as the last echoes of power faded from crystal walls. He collapsed to his knees, crushed by the weight of failure absolute. He had sought to save his father and become the instrument of doom instead. The Webway lay in ruins, demons stalked the imperial palace, and the Emperor's trust had shattered beyond repair. Worst of all, Horus remained free to pursue his treacherous course, the warning unheeded and unheeded. In the growing silence, Magnus began to understand the true nature of the trap that had ensnared him. His vision had been accurate, but incomplete. He had foreseen Horus's betrayal, but not his own role in enabling it. By destroying the Webway, he had crippled the Emperor's ability to respond to the coming crisis. By revealing his continued use of forbidden powers, he had validated every argument against the Librarius programs. He had become the perfect exemplar of why psychers could not be trusted, why the study of the warp led inevitably to corruption. As Magnus climbed the stairs back toward his sanctum, each step a monumental effort of will, he knew his doom was sealed. The Emperor would not forgive this transgression, could not without undermining the foundations of imperial law. The 1,000 suns would be marked for censure, perhaps destruction, and Prospero itself would pay the price for its master's hubris. The greatest tragedy was that Magnus had brought this fate upon himself through an act of love, a desperate attempt to save the father who would now be forced to destroy him. Above Prospero, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding below. In the City of Light, scholars and warriors pursued their studies, unaware that their Primarch's attempt to save the Imperium had sealed their doom instead. The first domino had fallen, and the cascade of destruction that would follow would reshape the galaxy forever. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, had become the unwitting herald of the very apocalypse he had sought to prevent. The psychic shockwave that erupted from Magnus's breach rippled across the galaxy, like a stone cast into still water. But nowhere was its impact more catastrophic than in the depths beneath the Imperial Palace. In the sacred chambers where the golden throne hummed with the power of a captive star, the Emperor of Mankind stood amid the ruins of his greatest work. The webway tunnels, painstakingly constructed over millennia, now resembled a shattered cathedral of crystal and light, their pristine walls cracked and bleeding ethereal energy into the void. Through every breach poured the inhabitants of the warp, entities of such malevolence that reality itself recoiled from their presence. Bloodletters of Khorne carved through dimensional barriers, with brass blades that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously, while plague-bearers of Nurgle spread corruption through the very foundations of the palace. The air itself screamed as horrors of Tzeentch danced through the collapsing passages, their laughter a symphony of madness that threatened to drive mortal minds to insanity. The Emperor's face, normally a mask of divine composure, showed the strain of containing catastrophe on a scale that dwarfed the destruction of worlds. His golden armor flickered with psychic discharge as he poured his immense will into sealing the largest breaches, but for every tier he closed, 3 more opened elsewhere. This was not war as mortals understood it, but a conflict fought in dimensions where thought became weapon and will determine victory. Each moment of delay allowed the demons to dig deeper, to corrupt more of the sacred architecture that had taken him 10,000 years to perfect. The irony cut deeper than any demon's blade. The Imperial Webway had been humanity's pathway to transcendence, designed to free his species from dependence on the treacherous currents of warp space. Now, in a single moment of desperate love, his most gifted son had transformed salvation into damnation. The Emperor could feel his strength being drained with each passing heartbeat, his vast reserves of psychic power flowing into the effort to hold back the tide of chaos that Magnus had unleashed. On Prospero, Magnus knelt in his ritual chamber, the weight of realization crushing down upon him like the gravity of a collapsing star. Through his psychic senses, he could perceive the unfolding disaster on Terra, feeling each demon's shriek as a personal wound. The Custodian Guard, the Emperor's most elite warriors, fought desperate holding actions against entities that followed no earthly logic. Their guardian spears, weapons that could carve through tank armor like parchment, barely scratched the brass hide of greater demons, while their auramite armor provided little protection against the reality-warping presence of the warp's children. The full scope of his transgression became clear with each passing moment. He had not merely violated the Edict of Nicaea, he had proven its necessity in the most catastrophic way possible. Every argument he had made for the controlled study of psychic powers, every plea for understanding the warp's mysteries, now lay in ruins alongside the Emperor's great work. His good intentions had paved a road not to salvation, but to a deeper, more profound hell. In the Pyramid of Photep's lower levels, Ahriman paused mid-annotation as psychic tremors rolled through Prospero's crystalline foundations. The chief librarian's enhanced senses detected the disturbance's source, though its full implications remained hidden. Around him, lesser psychers began to keen, blood flowing from nose and ears, as the aftershocks of Magnus's breach reached across the galaxy. With practiced efficiency, Ahriman set sleep across their minds like a soft cloth, then began ascending toward his Primarch's sanctum, dread growing with each step. On Terra, Malkador the Sigillite moved through galleries where golden reliefs recorded a future that would now never come to pass. The ancient Psyker's face bore the weight of centuries as he contemplated the magnitude of the disaster. The webway's destruction was not merely a strategic setback, but an existential threat to humanity's future. Without stable passages through the Immaterium, the Imperium would remain forever vulnerable to the predations of chaos. With heavy heart, Malkador began composing the orders that would seal Magnus's fate. The message took shape with crystalline clarity. The 6th Legion was to make all speed for Prospero. Leman Russ was to bring Magnus to Terra to answer for his crimes. The city was to be secured, its instruments impounded, its scholars catalogued. There were qualifiers, legal phrases whose teeth could be measured in centuries, but the core message was unmistakable. The astropathic transmission left Terra wrapped in psychic fire, carrying the Emperor's authority across the void. But in the warp's treacherous currents, other powers stirred. The message passed through eddies, where different hands had learned to warm the immaterial waters, where the War Master's influence had grown strong through careful cultivation of the warp's denizens. Horus Lupercal, seated upon the command throne of his flagship, read the Emperor's intent with the skill of a master politician. He saw opportunity in tragedy, a chance to turn the Emperor's own commands against him. The alteration was subtle, surgical in its precision. A syllable turned here, a clause sharpened there. Secure became pacify. Detain became execute if resistance is offered. The message did not notice itself changing, for in the warp, such transformations were the natural order of things. The corrupted orders continued their journey, bearing the patina of imperial authority while carrying the seeds of fratricide. When they reached Leman Russ, they would speak not of justice, but of execution, not of bringing a brother home, but of putting down a rabid dog. The trap that had ensnared Magnus was expanding, drawing in other players in the cosmic game. On Prospero, life continued with the rhythm of scholarly pursuit, unaware of the approaching storm. In the great libraries of Tizca, debates continued over metaphysical theories, while reality itself hemorrhaged around them. The 1,000 Suns went about their studies, pursuing knowledge with the dedication that had always defined their legion, ignorant of the fact that their Primarch's attempt to save the Imperium had sealed their doom. Magnus finally spoke, his voice echoing through the empty ritual chamber, like a prayer offered to an unforgiving god. "I did what I had to do," he whispered, but the words carried no conviction, only the hollow ring of justification that could not justify the unjustifiable. He walked to the crystal window overlooking his city, watching the lights of learning shine in the darkness, knowing that he was witnessing the last peaceful night Prospero would ever know. In the palace's underhalls, the battle for humanity's future continued with desperate intensity. The Emperor's will, vast and implacable, pressed against the demon incursion like a golden tide against a shore of brass and corruption. But he was no longer fighting merely to protect the palace. He was fighting to prevent the complete collapse of the webway network, to salvage something from the wreckage of his dreams. The realization settled over the imperial palace like a funeral shroud. The Great Crusade would have to continue without the Emperor's direct guidance, his attention forever divided between the material realm and the task of holding back the darkness his son had unleashed. The dream of a united galaxy, free from the warp's corruption, had died in the moment Magnus shattered the dimensional barriers. Now began the long, bitter harvest of that moment's tragic nobility, as the galaxy prepared to tear itself apart in the fires of civil war. Far across the void, the Wolf King received his orders and began preparations for a mission he believed righteous, but which would prove to be the first great tragedy of the heresy. The pieces were in motion, the trap was closing, and the doom of Prospero had begun its inexorable approach through the darkness between the stars. The astropathic message struck the Hrafunkel like a psychic thunderbolt, its arrival heralded by the screams of the ship's choir as they collapsed in unison, blood streaming from their eyes and ears. The flagship of the 6th Legion shuddered as reality itself seemed to recoil from the transmission's weight. The very bulkheads groaning under the pressure of imperial authority made manifest. In the depths of the vessel, servitors paused in their eternal labours as the echo of divine command rippled through the ship's systems, while space wolves throughout the fleet felt an inexplicable chill settle into their bones. Leman Russ stood in his command chamber when the message reached him, delivered by a trembling astropath whose hands shook as he extended the crystalline data slate. The Wolf King's amber eyes scanned the encoded runes, each symbol burning itself into his consciousness with the fire of absolute law. The words spoke of catastrophe beyond imagination. The imperial webway shattered, demons loose in the palace itself, and at the heart of it all, his brother, Magnus, the Crimson King of Prospero. The orders were clear in their condemnation. Magnus had violated the Edict of Nicaea in the most spectacular fashion possible, unleashing forces that threatened the very foundation of the Imperium. His attempt to warn the Emperor through forbidden means had instead become the instrument of terror's near destruction. The message painted a picture of arrogance transformed into treachery, of a son so consumed by his pursuit of forbidden knowledge that he had become the very threat he claimed to oppose. Yet as Russ read deeper, something nagged at his warrior's instincts like a splinter beneath armor. The language carried undertones that seemed wrong somehow. Where the Emperor's usual commands bore the weight of measured justice, these words carried a sharper edge, a finality that spoke not of correction, but of execution. The subtle shift from secure and detain to pacify resistance might have escaped a lesser mind, but Russ had spent 2 centuries learning to read between the lines of imperial politics. The second message arrived within hours, bearing the seal of the War Master. Horus's words were honey over steel, speaking to Russ in the language of brotherhood and shared duty. The War Master painted Magnus not as a wayward son, but as a lost cause, corrupted beyond redemption by his traffic with entities that should never have been contacted. He spoke of evidence, warp incursions on Prospero, forbidden rituals conducted in the City of Light's deepest chambers, the systematic corruption of an entire legion through their Primarch's hubris. Russ felt the familiar weight of his role as the Emperor's executioner, settling across his shoulders like a funeral shroud. How many times had he been called upon to end what could not be redeemed? How many worlds had burned because their rulers chose defiance over compliance? Yet this was different. This was Magnus, whose intellect had challenged him, whose passion for learning had both impressed and irritated him in equal measure. They had stood together on a dozen battlefields, had argued philosophy beneath alien stars, had shared the bitter wine of victory and the ashes of defeat. The Wolf King walked to his chamber's great viewing port, staring out at the star field that stretched toward distant Prospero. Somewhere in that direction lay the City of Light, its pyramids gleaming with accumulated knowledge, its libraries holding the wisdom of ages. His brother ruled there, surrounded by scholars and sorcerers who had transformed a world into humanity's greatest repository of learning. Could such a place truly have become a nest of corruption? Could Magnus, for all his arrogance and disregard for prohibition, have fallen so completely to chaos? The internal war that raged within Russ was fought on battlegrounds of memory and duty. He remembered Magnus during the triumph on Ulanor, standing tall and proud as the Emperor named Horus Warmaster, his single eye bright with genuine joy for their brother's elevation. He recalled their last conversation before Nicaea, Magnus pleading for understanding, for recognition that knowledge itself was not evil, only its misuse. The passion in his brother's voice had been real, the love for humanity undeniable, but duty spoke louder than memory. The Emperor's word was law, and that law had been broken in the most catastrophic way possible. The evidence was overwhelming. The webway lay in ruins, demons stalked the palace corridors, and Magnus stood at the center of it all. Whatever his intentions, whatever nobility might have driven him, the result was the same. He had become a threat to everything they had built, everything they had fought to achieve. Russ summoned his Jarls to the War Council chamber, where the pelts of Fenrisian ice bears hung alongside trophies from 100 conquered worlds. The assembled warriors represented the finest the 6th Legion had to offer, men who had followed him across the galaxy and never questioned his judgment. Now he would ask them to make war upon their brother Astartes, to spill the blood of those who had once fought at their side. "Brothers," Russ began, his voice carrying the authority of Primarch and Executioner, "we have received word from Terra. Magnus the Red has fallen to corruption, his legion with him. The Emperor commands that we bring them to account." The words felt like stones in his mouth, each one a weight that threatened to crush his spirit. Yet he spoke them with the conviction born of absolute loyalty, the faith that had never wavered even in the darkest hours of the crusade. The preparations began immediately, the space wolves transforming from explorers into instruments of judgment. Ships that had carried them to victory against Xenos empires now turned toward a different kind of war, one where the enemy spoke Gothic and bore the same genetic legacy as their hunters. Weapons were blessed, armor consecrated, and oaths renewed in the ancient traditions of Fenris. The wolf priests cast their bones and read omens in the patterns of ice and blood, their faces grave as they witnessed portents of brother war and the shattering of bonds that had seemed eternal. As the fleet prepared for translation to the warp, Russ stood alone in his private sanctum, surrounded by the simple truths of his homeworld. Here, among artifacts of ice and iron, he tried to reconcile the orders he had received with the memories that haunted him. The Magnus he remembered had been proud, certainly, perhaps too confident in his ability to master forces beyond mortal understanding. But he had also been genuinely devoted to humanity's advancement, passionate in his belief that knowledge could illuminate any darkness. The doubt that gnawed at him was a living thing, persistent as a Fenrisian winter. Yet beneath it lay something stronger, the absolute certainty that the Emperor's will must be done, regardless of personal cost. Russ had been forged as a weapon in his father's hands, shaped to cut where cutting was needed, to end what could not be saved. If Magnus had truly fallen, then that weapon would not hesitate to strike, no matter how deep the wound it left in his own soul. The fleet translated into the warp with the thunderous reality breach that marked the passage of an entire legion. In the Immaterium's chaotic currents, the ships of the 6th Legion carved their path toward destiny, guided by navigators whose third eyes pierced the warp's veils despite the storms that raged around Prospero's location. The journey would take weeks, time enough for doubt to fester or resolve to harden into diamond certainty. During those long days in Hell's embrace, Russ prepared himself for what was to come. He was the emperor's hound, loyal unto death, called upon to perform the duties that others could not stomach. If Magnus could be saved, he would save him. If not, he would do what duty demanded, no matter the cost to his own heart. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath as the Wolf King sailed toward his brother's world, carrying with him the weight of judgment and the bitter knowledge that some wounds, once inflicted, could never heal. On Prospero, the city of light continued its eternal pursuit of wisdom, unaware that death approached on wings of duty and sorrow. The doom of Prospero had begun its final approach through the darkness between the stars, and when it arrived, the galaxy would never be the same. The astropathic disturbance that had carried the Wolf King's orders across the galaxy left ripples in the warp that sensitive souls could feel like distant thunder. Yet on Prospero, these tremors were dismissed as the natural fluctuations of an unstable immaterium. In the city of light, dawn broke with its customary splendor, twin suns casting prismatic light through crystal spires, while the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 worlds lay open to minds eager for understanding. The irony was profound in its cruelty. Never had the pursuit of knowledge seemed more noble, more essential to humanity's future, than in these final hours before its violent interruption. Ahriman walked through the Corvidae archive with measured steps, his enhanced senses cataloguing the subtle variations in psychic resonance that emanated from each ancient text. The chief librarian had spent decades mapping the immaterium's currents with scholarly precision, yet today something felt fundamentally wrong. The psychic atmosphere carried undertones of disturbance, like the metallic taste that preceded a storm, and the normally harmonious emanations from his battle brothers seemed fractured, discordant in ways that defied easy explanation. In the Hall of Lang, Brother Captain Sobek led his fellowship through exercises designed to strengthen their psychic disciplines, unaware that each manifestation of their power sent ripples through dimensions where malevolent entities watched with growing interest. The 1,000 Suns had always prided themselves on their control, their ability to channel the warp's energies without succumbing to corruption. They saw themselves as scholars first, warriors second, men of learning who had transcended the crude brutality that defined so many of their brother legions. Brother Hathor Mart paused in his transcription of an ancient Terran philosophical treatise, his stylus hovering over parchment as an inexplicable wave of unease washed over him. The sensation was subtle, barely perceptible even to his enhanced consciousness, but it carried the unmistakable flavor of approaching change. Around him, other scribes continued their work with mechanical precision, minds focused entirely on preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost to time's erosion. They felt nothing of what troubled him, sensed nothing of the gathering storm that approached their world like a tide of judgment. The great libraries of Tizca hummed with quiet activity as scholars debated the finer points of xenoarchaeological theory, their voices a low murmur of intellectual fervor that had defined Prospero for over a century. In the laboratories, technicians conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of human understanding, while in the observatories, astronomers charted the movements of distant nebulae, seeking patterns in the cosmic dance that might reveal deeper truths about the universe's fundamental nature. High above this scene of scholarly tranquility in the pyramid of Photep's uppermost chambers, Magnus the Red remained in isolation that had become a prison of his own making. The Crimson King sat motionless upon his meditation throne, his towering frame carved from shadow and regret as he contemplated the magnitude of his transgression. The vision of the shattered webway played endlessly in his mind, each replay twisting the knife of guilt deeper into his superhuman heart. The temptation to warn his sons, to prepare them for the onslaught he knew was coming, was a constant agony that gnawed at his resolve. He could see the storm gathering on the horizon of prescient sight, grey ships bearing the wolf's head sigil, commanded by a brother whose loyalty to duty exceeded even his bonds of blood. The thought of his sons, philosophers and savants all, facing the brutal efficiency of the space wolves, filled him with a dread that threatened to shatter his remaining sanity. Yet to warn them would be to admit his failure, to expose the transgression that had doomed them all. It would validate every fear the Emperor had harbored about the Thousand Sons, every suspicion of their traffic with forbidden powers. More crucially, it would be an act of defiance against imperial justice that was surely already in motion. Magnus found himself caught in a trap of his own making, his options narrowed to two equally terrible choices: remain silent and allow his sons to be slaughtered in ignorance, or speak out and hasten the very judgment he had brought upon them. Ahriman felt the disturbance growing stronger as he ascended through the pyramid's levels, each step carrying him closer to his gene-father's sanctum. The psychic resonance that normally emanated from Magnus was muted, contained behind barriers of will that spoke of guilt and self-recrimination, profound beyond mortal understanding. The chief librarian had served his Primarch for over a century, had learned to read the subtle variations in his psychic signature, like others interpreted facial expressions. What he sensed now filled him with foreboding that had no rational foundation. The approach to Magnus's chambers was guarded by constructs of living crystal, entities that existed at the intersection of matter and energy, their forms shifting between states of being as they maintained eternal vigil. They recognized Ahriman's psychic signature and granted passage, their faceted eyes reflecting the inner turmoil that radiated from their creator like heat from a forge. The corridors beyond were lined with artifacts from across the galaxy, trophies of conquest and discovery that told the story of humanity's triumphant march among the stars. When Ahriman reached the sealed doors of the inner sanctum, he hesitated. The psychic barriers surrounding the chamber were more complex than anything he had encountered, layered with protections that spoke of desperate secrecy. Whatever knowledge his Primarch had gained, whatever truth he now carried, it was too dangerous to be shared, too terrible to be spoken aloud even to his most trusted sons. "My lord," Ahriman whispered, pressing his palm against the crystal surface, feeling the cold fire of contained power flowing beneath his touch. The Legion grows restless. There are disturbances in the warp, omens that speak of change approaching. We need guidance to navigate whatever storm comes. The words echoed in empty corridors, unanswered and seemingly unheard. Behind sealed doors, Magnus heard his son's plea, but could not bring himself to respond. How could he explain that the storm was already upon them, that his desperate attempt to save the Imperium had instead sealed their doom? The silence stretched between father and son, heavy with unspoken truths and approaching tragedy that would reshape the galaxy forever. In the city below, the Thousand Sons continued their eternal studies, unaware that their world had been marked for destruction by forces beyond their comprehension. Time was running out for the City of Light, though its inhabitants remained blissfully ignorant of their fate. The last peaceful hours of Prospero's existence slipped away, like sand through an hourglass, each grain a moment of tranquility that would soon exist only in memory. The doom of Prospero drew ever closer through the darkness between stars, carried by warriors who believed themselves righteous and commanded by a king, burdened with absolute duty. Soon, very soon, the age of scholars would end in fire and blood, and the galaxy would learn once again that knowledge, no matter how pure its pursuit, could not shield the innocent from the consequences of their father's love. The crystalline doors of the inner sanctum remained sealed as Ahriman pressed his palm against their surface one final time, feeling the cold fire of contained psychic energy flowing beneath his touch. The barriers surrounding Magnus's chamber had grown more complex since the previous day, layered with protections that spoke of desperate secrecy and profound guilt. Whatever knowledge his Primarch now carried, whatever truth he had discovered, it was too dangerous to be shared even with his most trusted son. "My lord," Ahriman whispered into the silence, his voice carrying the weight of growing dread. "The Legion requires guidance. There are disturbances in the warp, signs that speak of approaching change. We must know how to prepare." The words echoed in empty corridors, unanswered and seemingly unheard, though both father and son knew the plea had reached its intended target. Behind the sealed doors, Magnus heard his chief librarian's entreaty, but could not bring himself to respond. How could he explain that the storm was already upon them, that his desperate attempt to save the Imperium had instead sealed their doom? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and approaching tragedy that would reshape the galaxy forever. With reluctant acceptance, Ahriman finally turned away, his footsteps echoing through the pyramid's corridors as he descended toward the city below. The chief librarian's enhanced senses detected subtle changes in Prospero's psychic atmosphere, disturbances that grew stronger with each passing hour. Something vast and hostile was approaching through the warp's treacherous currents, and his Gene father's silence in the face of this threat filled him with foreboding that had no rational foundation. Magnus waited until his son's presence faded before allowing the barriers to thin, just enough to sense the growing disturbance in the immaterium. The approaching fleet carved through warp space like a blade through flesh, guided by the implacable will of his brother, Leman Russ. The Wolf King came not as family, but as executioner, carrying the Emperor's judgment in his wake. Magnus could feel that cold purpose burning across the void like a distant star, relentless and absolute in its duty. The temptation to warn his sons, to prepare them for the onslaught he knew was coming, was a constant agony that gnawed at his resolve. Yet to do so would be to admit his failure, to expose the transgression that had doomed them all. More crucially, it would validate every fear the Emperor had harbored about the Thousand Sons, every suspicion of their traffic with forbidden powers. Magnus found himself caught in a trap of his own making, his options narrowed to two equally terrible choices: remain silent and allow his sons to be slaughtered in ignorance, or speak out and compound the very crimes that had brought judgment upon them. The decision crystallized in his mind with the terrible clarity of absolute despair. He would not warn them. He would not prepare Prospero for war. In his twisted logic, born of guilt and self-recrimination, Magnus convinced himself that his legion deserved whatever punishment the Emperor saw fit to deliver. Their pursuit of forbidden knowledge had made them complicit in his transgression. Every ritual they had performed, every text they had studied, every moment they had spent delving into the mysteries of the Immaterium had contributed to the catastrophe that now threatened the Imperium itself. Rising from his meditation throne, Magnus moved to the great window that overlooked his domain. Tizca spread before him like a jewel of learning, its spires reaching toward the stars in testament to humanity's capacity for growth and understanding. In the streets below, his sons continued their eternal studies, moving with the confidence of the righteous, secure in their belief that knowledge was its own shield against the galaxy's darkness. How tragically wrong they were. The Primarch activated the pyramid's communication systems with a thought, sending carefully crafted orders to his captains throughout the city. The messages spoke of routine preparations, defensive postures, adopted as precautionary measures against possible warp storms. No weapons were to be readied for battle. No shields were to be raised against orbital assault. The 1,000 suns would meet their fate as they had lived, as scholars first, warriors second. In the lower levels of the pyramid, Brother Captain Sobek received his orders with growing confusion. The defensive preparations seemed inadequate for the level of disturbance his psychic senses detected in the warp, yet his Gene Father's commands were explicit. No aggressive action was to be taken. No first strike was to be contemplated. The 15th Legion would await whatever judgment approached with dignity and restraint. Ahriman emerged into the streets of Tizca as the first subtle signs of preparation began to manifest throughout the city. Citizens were being quietly guided toward the deep shelters beneath the pyramids, told that solar flare activity required temporary evacuation to the protected zones. The lies came easily to lips trained in diplomacy, though the speaker's eyes carried shadows of uncertainty that had not been there at dawn. The chief librarian made his way to the great library, where thousands of scholars continued their work in blissful ignorance of the approaching catastrophe. Ancient texts were being discreetly relocated to the deepest vaults, priceless artifacts secured behind barriers of crystal and will. Yet even these preparations seemed woefully inadequate for what Ahriman's enhanced senses told him was coming. The psychic disturbance in the warp spoke not of censure or investigation, but of absolute judgment. High above the city, Magnus pressed his palm against the crystal window and felt the pulse of psychic energy that flowed through every stone of his world. This place had been built as a monument to the pursuit of understanding, a beacon of enlightenment in a galaxy too often ruled by ignorance and brutality. Now it would become a monument to the price of forbidden knowledge, a cautionary tale written in blood and ash for future generations to study and fear. The decision to remain silent was not born of cowardice, but of a twisted form of nobility that only a being of Magnus's intellectual complexity could have conceived. He convinced himself that by accepting punishment without resistance, he was taking responsibility for his actions in the most complete way possible. His sons would die, yes, but their deaths would serve a greater purpose, demonstrating to the galaxy that even the mightiest could be brought low by hubris and the pursuit of forbidden truths. As the hours passed and the psychic disturbance in the warp grew stronger, Magnus felt the weight of each moment pressing down upon him like the gravity of a collapsing star. Soon, very soon, the Wolf King's fleet would translate back into real space, and the last age of Prospero would begin. The libraries would burn, the scholars would scream, and the greatest repository of human learning would be reduced to radioactive ash and bitter memory. The stars themselves seemed to dim as Magnus made his final preparations, not for war, but for martyrdom. In seeking to save the Imperium through forbidden knowledge, he had doomed his legion. In trying to warn the Emperor, he had sealed his own fate. The Crimson King had become the architect of his own downfall, and now he would watch in silence as his masterpiece crumbled into dust, believing to the end that love and sacrifice might yet serve some greater purpose in the cosmic tragedy that was about to unfold. The translation from warp space came like the tearing of reality's fabric, a violent rupture that sent shockwaves through the immaterium and announced the arrival of judgment itself. Above Prospero's serene skies, where twin suns had cast their gentle light upon the City of Light for over a century, the void suddenly blazed with the fury of 1,000 warships. The 6th Legion's fleet materialized with brutal efficiency, their grey hulls bearing the snarling wolf's head that had become synonymous with the Emperor's wrath across 100 conquered worlds. On the surface, the psychic shockwave struck Tizca like a physical blow. In the pyramid of Photep, the astropathic choir collapsed in unison, blood streaming from their eyes and ears, as their enhanced minds recoiled from the sheer weight of hostile intent that now pressed down upon their world. Throughout the city, scholars paused in their studies as an inexplicable chill settled into their bones, while delicate instruments in the laboratories began registering disturbances that defied rational explanation. Ahriman felt the fleet's arrival like a knife between his shoulder blades, the sudden manifestation of so much focused malevolence causing his psychic senses to recoil in shock. The chief librarian abandoned his vigil outside Magnus's sealed sanctum and rushed to the pyramid's highest observatory, his enhanced vision piercing the atmospheric haze to reveal the terrible truth written across the starfield. Grey ships hung in orbit like birds of prey, their weapon batteries already rotating toward firing positions with deadly precision. The communication that followed carried the authority of imperial law, wrapped in the Wolf King's growling voice. Magnus the Red, Layman Russ spoke across the void, his words transmitted on all frequencies with the weight of absolute judgment. You stand accused of violating the Edict of Nicaea and bringing ruin upon the Emperor's great work. Surrender yourself and your legion for transport to Terra, where you will answer for these crimes before the Golden Throne. In his sealed sanctum, Magnus heard his brother's words, but made no move to respond. The Crimson King sat motionless upon his meditation throne, his single eye closed as if in prayer, his towering frame carved from shadow and acceptance. He had known this moment would come, had seen it in visions that played endlessly in his tormented mind. The Wolf King came not as family, but as executioner, carrying the Emperor's judgment in his wake. The silence that followed Russ's ultimatum stretched across the void like a held breath, pregnant with approaching catastrophe. On the Raffenkel's bridge, the Wolf King waited for his brother's response, amber eyes fixed upon the glittering jewel of Tizca as it turned slowly in the light of Prospero's twin suns. Each passing moment without answer was another step toward inevitable violence, another confirmation of guilt that duty demanded he address. When no reply came after the prescribed time, Russ gave the order that would echo through history as one of the heresy's first tragedies. All vessels, commence orbital bombardment. Target planetary defense systems first, then military installations. Surgical strikes only. The commands carried the weight of duty performed without joy. A brother's love transformed into the instrument of judgment. The first salvo struck Prospero's orbital defense platforms with devastating precision, turning centuries of engineering achievement into expanding clouds of superheated debris. Lance batteries that had never fired in anger were vaporized before their crews could comprehend what was happening, while void shields designed to repel asteroid impacts crumpled like paper before Imperial firepower. On the surface, citizens of Tizca looked up in wonder and growing horror as artificial stars bloomed in their sky, the death of orbital installations marking the beginning of their world's end. In the great libraries, scholars abandoned their texts and rushed to windows, faces pale with disbelief as they witnessed the systematic dismantling of everything they had built. The sky over Tizca flowered with white scars as spears of light burned down from orbit. The bombardment was surgical in its precision, designed to cripple Prospero's ability to mount organized resistance while minimizing damage to the irreplaceable repositories of knowledge. Lance strikes sheared through starport spires, collapsing docking plates in showers of molten debris, while defensive pylons that could have shielded the city died in silence, their focusing crystals shattered by perfectly aimed shots. Ahriman descended through the pyramid's levels with desperate urgency, his enhanced senses detecting panic spreading through the city like wildfire. In the streets below, Thousand Sons warriors emerged from their studies to stare at the burning sky, their faces masks of confusion and growing dread. They had prepared for many things in their service to the Imperium, but never for this. War against their brother Astartes, judgment delivered from orbit by those who had once fought at their side. The chief librarian reached Magnus's sealed sanctum and pressed both palms against the crystal barriers, pouring his will into breaking through his gene-father's isolation. "My lord," he cried, voice cracking with desperation. "The space wolves are here. They're bombarding the orbital stations. We must respond." The words echoed in empty corridors, carrying a son's plea for guidance in the face of incomprehensible betrayal. Behind the sealed doors, Magnus heard Ahriman's entreaty, but remained motionless. To respond would be to admit his failure, to expose the transgression that had brought this judgment upon them all. In his twisted logic, born of guilt and self-recrimination, the Crimson King convinced himself that his legion deserved whatever punishment the Emperor saw fit to deliver. The second wave of bombardment struck surface installations, military bases that had stood for centuries, vanishing in pillars of atomic fire. Drop pods began their descent like falling stars, carrying the instruments of the Emperor's wrath toward Prospero's surface. Thunderhawks followed, their grey hulls cutting through smoke-filled skies as they sought landing zones among the burning ruins of the outer city. In the great library, Brother Captain Sobek felt the building shudder as nearby strikes sent shockwaves through the crystal foundations. Around him, ancient weapons were retrieved from storage vaults, while power armor was donned with hands that trembled despite their superhuman steadiness. The Thousand Sons had always prided themselves on scholarship over warfare, but they were still Astartes, still the Emperor's chosen warriors. The first drop pods struck Tizca's plazas with seismic impacts that shattered windows and knocked citizens to their knees. Hatches blew with percussive force, and space wolves burst into the city of light, with howls that spoke of duty transformed into vengeance. Their bolters were raised, muzzles tracking for targets among the crimson-armored figures who stood in stunned disbelief at this unprecedented betrayal. Panic, a sensation rarely seen on disciplined Prospero, began rippling through the streets. Citizens who had been moving calmly toward designated shelters now broke into desperate flight, their orderly retreat dissolving into terrified stampede. The Thousand Sons, caught utterly unprepared, found themselves facing an enemy they had never imagined. Their own brothers, transformed by duty into instruments of destruction. As the artificial dawn of orbital fire painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the last peaceful age of Prospero came to its violent end. The scholars who had spent their lives pursuing truth now faced a reality more terrible than any they had imagined. While in the highest spire of the pyramid of Photep, their primarch sat in silence, accepting damnation as the price of love misguided and wisdom pursued too far. The doom of Prospero had begun in earnest, and the galaxy would never be the same. The assault on Tizca's heart began with surgical precision, each bolter round and melter blast calculated to maximize destruction, while preserving the structural integrity needed for systematic purging. The space wolves advanced through the outer districts like a grey tide, their movements coordinated by vox channels that crackled with clipped Fenrisian commands. Behind them came the Sisters of Silence, their psychic null fields spreading like frost across the city's crystalline foundations, severing the immaterial connections that had made Prospero a nexus of learning for over a century. Ahriman felt their approach, like the onset of blindness, his enhanced senses recoiling from the void that preceded the anathema psychona. The chief librarian had spent decades mapping the warp's currents with scholarly precision, but now those familiar pathways withered beneath the sister's terrible gift. Where once his mind had soared through dimensions of pure thought, now there remained only the crushing weight of mundane reality and the growing certainty that everything he had built was about to burn. The great library of Tizca rose before the advancing forces like a crystal cathedral, its spires reaching toward Prospero's twin suns in testament to humanity's capacity for growth and understanding. Within its halls, Brother Captain Sobek marshaled his fellowship with the desperate efficiency of a scholar watching his life's work threatened by barbarians. These were men who had spent more time with stylus than sword, minds trained for contemplation rather than combat. Yet they moved to defensive positions with the fluid grace that marked all of the Emperor's chosen. "Preserve what you can," Sobek commanded, his voice carrying across vox channels that hummed with barely contained panic. "Priority Alpha text to the deep vaults. Everything else." He paused, unable to voice the terrible calculus that survival demanded. Around him, his battle brothers began the heartbreaking process of triage, selecting which fragments of human achievement might survive the approaching storm. The first space wolves to breach the library's outer chambers moved with the methodical precision of executioners rather than destroyers. Brother Sergeant Godric led his pack through corridors lined with crystalline shelves, his amber eyes scanning titles that represented millennia of accumulated wisdom. The irony was not lost on him that he was about to destroy knowledge that had taken ages to gather, yet duty demanded compliance with orders that brooked no interpretation. "Heretical materials are to be purged." He growled into his vox bead, raising his bolter toward a towering collection of philosophical treatises. "No exceptions." The explosive rounds that followed sent fragments of priceless manuscripts cascading through the air like snow, each piece a fragment of understanding that would never again illuminate human minds. Ahriman burst through the main entrance as the systematic destruction reached its crescendo, his psychic senses recoiling from the magnitude of cultural genocide unfolding before his eyes. The sight that greeted him defied comprehension. Grey-armored warriors moving through corridors of knowledge like wolves through a sheepfold, their weapons raised against treasures that represented the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement. "Stop!" The chief librarian's voice carried the authority of a legion officer and the desperation of a scholar witnessing the murder of wisdom itself. "These texts are irreplaceable. They contain knowledge that belongs to all humanity." His words echoed through chambers where the sound of destruction had momentarily paused, space wolves turning to regard this crimson-armored figure who dared challenge their sacred duty. Brother Sergeant Godric lowered his bolter slightly, meeting Ahriman's gaze across a battlefield of burning books. "Stand down, sorcerer," he replied, voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "These works are corrupted by your legion's traffic with forbidden powers. They cannot be allowed to spread their poison further." The accusation struck like a physical blow, reducing decades of careful scholarship to mere heresy in a single dismissive phrase. Around them, flames began licking at manuscripts that had survived the fall of civilizations, ancient parchment providing eager fuel for conflagration that would soon consume everything Ahriman held sacred. The battle that erupted was unlike any the galaxy had witnessed during the Great Crusade. Here were brothers who had once stood together against Xenos empires, now spilling each other's blood among the very texts that chronicled their shared victories. bolter rounds designed to pierce alien armor punched through philosophical treatises, while chainswords that had carved through enemy flesh reduced scientific observations to scattered fragments. Brother Hathor Marn died defending a collection of pre-imperial poetry, his body falling across verses that spoke of love and loss in languages that would now be forgotten forever. The Thousand Suns warrior's blood seeped into parchment that had survived the long night, adding one final stanza to humanity's greatest literary achievement before the flames claimed it all. The smoke rising from burning libraries carried more than ashes of paper and crystal. Each wisp bore the dreams of scholars, the accumulated wisdom of ages, the patient work of minds that had sought to illuminate darkness through understanding rather than conquest. In the observatory of distant suns, where astronomers had charted nebulae and catalogued stellar births, Lascannons turned delicate instruments into superheated vapor, erasing decades of observation in moments of brutal efficiency. Ahriman fought with desperate fury, his force sword carving through space wolf armor, while his diminished psychic abilities strained to preserve what manuscripts he could through telekinetic manipulation. But for every text he saved, a dozen more fell victim to systematic purging, the accumulated wisdom of centuries vanishing in explosions of righteous fire. The destruction followed protocols established for cleansing heretical materials. Every manuscript dealing with psychic phenomena was marked for immediate incineration. Every text containing warp-based technologies was consigned to flame. The space wolves moved through libraries like antibodies through infected tissue, identifying and eliminating what they had been trained to recognize as sources of corruption. In chambers where philosophical debates had once echoed, only the roar of flames and screams of dying warriors remained. The battle raged through corridors where the greatest minds in human history had walked, their footsteps replaced by thunder of ceramite boots and crash of falling shelves. Both sides remained convinced of their righteousness, even as they destroyed what could never be replaced. As fires spread and destruction reached crescendo, the last age of learning on Prospero came to violent end. Libraries that had stood as monuments to human achievement transformed into funeral pyres for wisdom itself, their burning light visible from orbit as testament to the price of knowledge pursued too far and love expressed too desperately. Above the carnage, in the pyramid of Photep's highest chamber, Magnus felt each loss as a personal wound, but remained motionless upon his throne. The galaxy had grown darker, and shadows would never again be illuminated by the gentle radiance that had once emanated from the City of Light. The smoke rising from the burning libraries carried more than the ashes of knowledge. It bore the acrid stench of brotherhood dying in fire and blood. Where moments before the systematic destruction of Prospero's treasures had proceeded with clinical efficiency, now the plaza before the great library echoed with the clash of ceramite and the roar of bolt weapons as crimson and grey warriors met in desperate combat. The space wolves had completed their grim work of purging heretical texts, but the Thousand Suns could no longer stand idle while their world burned around them. Captain Kalophis of the Sixth Fellowship emerged from the ruins of the Philosophic Archive with his surviving battle brothers, their crimson armor scorched black by flames that had consumed centuries of accumulated wisdom. The Thousand Suns, warriors' enhanced senses detected the approaching space wolves through smoke that burned his throat with each breath, their grey forms moving with the practiced efficiency of predators who had hunted across 100 worlds. These were no longer the brothers who had shared victory wine beneath alien stars, but instruments of judgment transformed by duty into something harder and more terrible. Brother Sergeant Amlodi led his grey hunters across the Plaza of Remembrance, where monuments to shared victories now stood as silent witnesses to fraternal war. The space wolf's amber eyes fixed upon the crimson figures who waited among memorial statues, his enhanced olfactory senses detecting the familiar gene scent of his cousins. Memory triggered unbidden, these same warriors standing beside him on Ulinor's triumph grounds, sharing rations during the siege of Gyros Thravian, mourning mutual dead in the aftermath of the Laia campaign. "You were our brothers once," Calophis called across the plaza, his voice carrying over the crackle of flames and distant explosions. "We stood together on a dozen battlefields, shared the triumph of compliance across the galaxy. Why do you bring war to Prospero?" The question hung in the smoke-filled air, like a prayer offered to an unforgiving god, carrying the weight of relationships severed by duty and misunderstanding. Amlodi's response came wrapped in the growling accent of Fenris, each word heavy with absolute conviction. "You fell to corruption, sorcerer. Your Primarch's arrogance has doomed us all, and the Emperor's justice must be served." The space wolf raised his bolter, the weapon's muzzle tracking toward hearts that had once beaten in rhythm with his own during the Great Crusade's darkest hours. The battle that erupted was unlike any engagement either legion had fought during 2 centuries of conquest. These were warriors who knew each other's tactics, who had studied together in the war colleges of terror, who could predict their opponent's movements with familiarity born of shared experience. Yet that knowledge, which should have bred respect and caution, instead fueled a fury that burned hotter than the flames consuming Prospero's libraries. Calophis moved with fluid grace, his force sword carving arcs of psychic fire through air thick with smoke and falling ash. The blade met Amlodi's chainsword in a shower of sparks that illuminated faces twisted by duty and betrayal. 2 brothers locked in mortal combat while their genetic fathers watched from orbit and tower respectively. Around them, the plaza became a killing ground where decades of shared brotherhood died in explosions of bolt round and blade. In the memorial gardens, Thousand Sons Terminators took cover behind monuments to their own achievements, the twisted symbolism not lost on Sergeant Balek as he crouched behind marble carved to honor his victory on Morningstar. Bolt rounds chipped away at stone, while space wolves advanced through carefully tended paths, where both legions had once walked in friendship. The Grey Warriors moved with pack tactics honed on ice worlds, their coordination speaking to bonds the Thousand Suns, for all their psychic unity, could not match. Brother Captain Phosis Takar found himself confronted by a hulking space wolf, clad in the pelts of Fenrisian ice bears, their weapons locking in deadly embrace. Takar recognized the personal heraldry, scorched into grey ceramite, markings belonging to a warrior he had shared rations with on Xylos' ravaged plains. They had fought side by side against Xenos hordes, their legions united in the Emperor's Great Crusade. Now their blades were turned upon each other, shared history reduced to prelude for fratricide. "Why, brother?" Takar's voice strained through his helmet's voxcaster. "What crime have we committed that warrants this?" The space wolf's face contorted in grim determination as he pushed harder, powerful frame threatening to overwhelm the more slender Thousand Sun. "Your sorcery is anathema. Your Primarch has betrayed the Emperor. Justice demands your reckoning." The fighting spread through Tizca's streets like wildfire, consuming not just buildings, but the very concept of brotherhood that had sustained the legions through 2 centuries of conquest. In marketplaces, where citizens had once debated philosophy, warriors who shared genetic heritage spilled each other's blood with methodical precision. The screams of dying mingled with roar of flames and crash of falling masonry, creating a symphony of destruction that would echo through history. Ahriman cut through space wolves in the Hall of Transcriptions, feeling the psychic silence of approaching sisters of silence, like physical weight pressing down on his mind. Their null fields made his innate abilities falter just as he needed them most. He saw grim satisfaction in grey-armoured eyes as their silent maidens advanced, weapons raised to deliver final blows to a legion whose power was being systematically choked. The chief librarian's force sword hummed with barely contained energy, its crimson glow stark against muted grey enemies. He fought with ferocity born of despair, each parry and thrust desperate attempt to protect knowledge being consumed around him. When a space wolf raised his bolter toward irreplaceable star charts, Ahriman unleashed raw, uncontrolled psychic force with a roar of pure anguish. The attacker was thrown backward, armor crumpling, but damage was done. The charts burst into conflagration that quickly spread. The tragedy was almost unbearable. These were not faceless enemies, but brothers, each bearing proud symbols of their legion's heritage. Space wolves wore the wolf head and Fenrisian knotwork, speaking of courage and loyalty, while Thousand Suns displayed intricate sigils of their Corvidae, Athenian, Pyre, or Raptora cults, symbols of dedication to understanding the universe. Now these emblems clashed, not in friendly rivalry, but desperate struggle for survival. As battle reached crescendo, both sides remained convinced of their righteousness, even as they destroyed what could never be replaced. The space wolves fought with absolute certainty of duty performed, while Thousand Suns died defending knowledge they believed essential to humanity's future. Neither could see the larger tragedy. Their conflict served purposes of powers far darker than either imagined, entities that fed on dissolution of brotherhood and corruption of noble purpose. In smoke-filled plazas, where monuments to shared victory crumbled beneath fraternal war's weight, the last bonds between legions were severed forever. The age of unity was ending in fire and blood, and the galaxy would never again witness the terrible beauty of humanity united in common cause. High above the carnage, in the pyramid of Photep's sealed sanctum, Magnus felt each loss as personal wound, but remained motionless upon his throne, accepting damnation as the price of love misguided and wisdom pursued too far. The doom of Prospero had become herald of something far worse, the death of hope itself, written in blood of brothers who had once stood together against darkness between the stars. The crystalline barriers that had sealed Magnus within his sanctum for hours finally shattered like ice beneath volcanic pressure, their destruction sending psychic shockwaves through the pyramid of Photep's ancient foundations. The breaking point had not come from external force, but from within, triggered by a single, devastating moment that cut through the Crimson King's noble resignation, like a blade through silk. In the burning streets below, Brother Hathor Mart had died, clutching a collection of pre-imperial poetry to his chest, his screams echoing through both material and immaterial realms, as Promethean flames consumed knowledge that would never, again, illuminate human minds. That psychic cry of anguish, raw and unfiltered, tore through the layers of guilt and self-imposed silence that Magnus had wrapped around himself like funeral shrouds. The Primarch's single eye snapped open, blazing within a fire that had been contained too long behind walls of acceptance and martyrdom. The careful construct of noble suffering crumbled in an instant, replaced by something far more primal and infinitely more dangerous. The protective fury of a father watching his sons die for crimes they had never committed. The psychic eruption that followed was felt across Prospero's entire surface, a silent scream of power that made reality itself recoil in shock. In the streets of Tizca, Sisters of Silence stumbled as their null fields were pushed back by sheer magnitude of will, while space wolves paused mid-stride as their enhanced senses detected the awakening of something vast and terrible. The very air began to thicken with potential energy, charged particles dancing in patterns that spoke of dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. Magnus rose from his meditation throne like a crimson star achieving critical mass, his towering frame wreathed in energies that made the pyramid's ancient stones sing with harmonic resonance. The Primarch's physical form began to swell with barely contained power, reality warping around him as forces from realms where thought and matter were one responded to their master's call. Each step he took toward the sealed doors left molten prints in crystal floors, while the air around him shimmered with heat that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. On the Hrafnkel's bridge, Leman Russ felt his brother's awakening like a blade between his ribs, the psychic pressure pressing against his mind with increasing intensity. The Wolf King's amber eyes turned skyward, tracking the crimson radiance that now blazed above Tizka's burning spires like a second sun. He had hoped, despite everything, that Magnus would surrender with dignity befitting a Primarch. Instead, his brother had chosen defiance, and that choice transformed what should have been justice into something far more terrible. "Prepare my Thunderhawk," Russ commanded, his voice carrying the weight of duty performed without joy. "Signal the custodian guard. We descend to finish this." The orders tasted like ashes in his mouth, but the evidence was undeniable. Magnus had unleashed his forbidden powers rather than submit to imperial judgment, proving every accusation leveled against him. The doors of the Pyramid of Photep exploded outward in a shower of pulverized crystal and twisted adamantium, their destruction announcing the emergence of something that belonged more to myth than reality. Magnus strode forth like a fallen angel seeking redemption through violence, his crimson armor glowing with inner light that pulsed with the rhythm of a dying star. The Primarch's features, usually serene with scholarly contemplation, were now contorted into a mask of devastating rage that spoke of love transformed into weapon. Thunderhawks descended from orbit like oaths made manifest, their grey hulls cutting through smoke-filled skies as they sought landing zones among the burning ruins. Russ's drop pod struck the Plaza of Remembrance with seismic force, the impact crater spreading outward like a wound in Prospero's crystal heart. The Wolf King emerged wreathed in fire and fury, his frost blade already drawn and gleaming with killing light forged in Fenris's heart. The two Primarchs faced each other across a battlefield littered with the bodies of their sons, demigods whose genetic heritage traced back to the same divine source, now preparing to destroy each other. Magnus towered above the carnage like a crimson colossus, his single eye burning within a fire that had consumed restraint and mercy alike. Russ stood opposite him, Wolfhelm gleaming in the light of burning libraries, every line of his posture speaking of absolute conviction, wedded to profound sorrow. "Brother," Magnus spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, each word weighted with the anguish of a world dying around them. "You come to my realm as executioner, destroying knowledge that took millennia to gather. Do you even comprehend what you have done? What you are destroying in the name of blind obedience?" Russ raised his blade, its edge gleaming with runes that spoke of duty and sacrifice. "I understand that you have fallen, Magnus. Your arrogance brought demons into the palace itself, shattered the Emperor's great work, and proven every fear about your legion's corruption. The judgment was given. It will be executed." The Wolf King's response came wrapped in absolute conviction, though his amber eyes carried shadows that spoke of bonds severed and brotherhood dying. Fallen? Magnus's laughter was the sound of stars going nova, bitter and magnificent in its despair. I sought to warn him of Horus's treachery. I risked everything to save our father from betrayal, and this is my reward. You are nothing but a blind hound, unleashed by masters who have been deceived by darker powers than you can imagine. The accusation struck deep, awakening doubts that Russ had buried beneath layers of duty and certainty. Yet he pushed them aside, raising his blade with movements that spoke of skills honed across 2 centuries of conquest. Lies born of corruption. You traffic with entities that should never be contacted. Pursue knowledge that belongs to realms beyond mortal understanding. I am here to end what should never have begun. The duel that erupted between them was less combat than cosmic phenomenon. 2 forces of nature colliding with energies that belong to the birth of galaxies. Magnus fought with powers drawn from dimensions where reality was merely suggestion, space warping around his gestures as he sought to overwhelm his brother through sheer psychic might. Russ answered with Primarch strength, wedded to Fenrisian cunning, his blade carving through dimensional barriers as he pressed his attack with relentless determination. Around them, both legions found their conflicts momentarily forgotten as they witnessed the titanic struggle of their gene fathers. This was more than personal combat. It was the collision of 2 philosophies rendered in violence and blood, the death of unity written in the clash of superhuman will against primordial fury. Magnus unleashed energies that turned sand to glass beneath his feet, while conjuring shields of pure thought to deflect his brother's devastating attacks. Russ countered with blade work that spoke of mastery earned through countless battles, each strike calculated to pierce the defenses of a being who had once stood as humanity's greatest psyker. The very ground beneath their feet groaned under the strain of their conflict, reality warping as 2 demigods sought to prove their righteousness through force of arms. The doom of Prospero had become something far worse than the destruction of a single world. It was the death of hope itself, written in the blood of brothers who had once stood together against the darkness between stars, their fraternal war-serving purposes that neither could comprehend, while powers older than human civilization watched and smiled in the warp's depths. The psychic shockwaves unleashed by the titanic duel between Magnus and Russ rippled through dimensions, both material and immaterial. Each collision of Frostblade against Crimson while sending tremors that penetrated the very essence of Prospero itself. In the burning streets of Tizca, where Thousand Suns warriors fought desperate holding actions against their grey-armoured brothers, the accumulated stress of battle and proximity to such raw, uncontrolled power began triggering changes that had lain dormant in their genetic code for over a century. Brother Sergeant Menkara of the Third Fellowship felt it first as a tingling sensation in his left gauntlet, a subtle wrongness that spread through ceramite and flesh alike with inexorable persistence. The veteran warrior paused mid-reload, his enhanced senses detecting something fundamentally amiss in his own physiology. What began as discomfort quickly escalated into agony as his power armor's crimson surface began to ripple like liquid metal, the sacred ceramite responding to changes occurring within the flesh it was meant to protect. The transformation that followed was neither swift nor merciful. Menkara's enhanced physiology, designed to resist toxins and diseases that would kill lesser men, offered no protection against corruption, written into his very genes by forces beyond mortal comprehension. His limbs elongated at impossible angles, while his helmet cracked to accommodate a skull, reshaping itself according to patterns that belonged to nightmare rather than nature. The screams that erupted from his vox grill were barely recognizable as human, carrying harmonics that spoke of consciousness trapped within mutating flesh. Ahriman felt the psychic disturbance like a blade between his ribs, the familiar sensation of the flesh change awakening after decades of careful suppression. The chief librarian had dedicated countless hours to studying this curse, seeking ways to contain or cure the mutation that had plagued his legion since their earliest days on Terra. Now, as he watched his battle brother collapse into writhing mass of flesh and bone, all his research proved inadequate against the magnitude of disaster unfolding around him. The curse spread through Tizca's defenders, like wildfire through drought-stricken forests, each manifestation unique in its horror, yet united in its fundamental wrongness. Brother Captain Phosis Takar, locked in combat with a hulking space wolf in the Memorial Gardens, suddenly felt his carefully maintained control slipping as familiar tingling preceded transformation. The veteran had survived the curse's manifestation twice before through discipline and will that bordered on superhuman, but now the psychic energies washing over him from the Primarch's battle proved too much for even his iron determination. "Not now," Takar whispered through gritted teeth, pressing his back against a marble statue while his opponent advanced with raised chainsword. "Not here. Not like this." His prayers went unanswered as flesh began reshaping itself beneath his armor, bones elongating and muscles writhing with changes that spoke of purposes beyond human understanding. The space wolf who faced him recoiled in horror and vindication, seeing confirmation of everything he had been told about Thousand Suns' corruption. Throughout the burning city, the ancient curse claimed its victims with methodical precision. In the ruins of the Great Library, Brother Sobek watched his own hand flower into an inflorescence of digits that had never known a trigger's curve, his polite refusal of this unwanted transformation carrying the weight of a lifetime's civil discourse. Captain Kalophis tried to maintain order among his rapidly diminishing forces, but found himself confronting an enemy more terrible than any space wolf assault, as his own warriors transformed before his eyes. The space wolves who witnessed these transformations experienced a complex mixture of horror and vindication that spoke to the tragedy's deeper implications. Brother Sergeant Amlodi watched crimson-armored warriors dissolve into gibbering monstrosities, his amber gaze hardening with righteous fury, even as part of him recoiled from the magnitude of suffering he witnessed. Here was proof of everything they had been told about the Thousand Suns' corruption, evidence that their brothers had indeed fallen to powers that should never have been contacted. "Sorcery!" Amlodi snarled, raising his bolter toward a transforming abomination that had once been a proud Astartes warrior. "They are lost to corruption. Show them the Emperor's mercy." The explosive rounds that followed were acts of mercy rather than murder, ending suffering that had become too terrible to endure. The Sisters of Silence advanced through this chaos like personal winters, their null fields creating zones of psychic vacuum that seemed to accelerate rather than prevent the transformations. Where their anti-psychic auras touched mutating warriors, the curse appeared to intensify, as if the sudden suppression of their abilities created a void that dormant corruption rushed to fill. Their emotionless faces regarded the horror around them with grim satisfaction, seeing only confirmation of the taint they had been sent to purge. Ahriman moved through these scenes of unfolding nightmare with growing desperation, his enhanced senses tracking the spread of mutations through his legion's ranks. The chief librarian found himself making choices that would haunt him for eternity. delivering merciful deaths to brothers whose minds had already been consumed by change. Each bolt of psychic energy he unleashed was both weapon and prayer, ending suffering while adding another weight to his soul's already crushing burden. The irony was bitter beyond measure. The Thousand Suns had always prided themselves on their control, their ability to channel the warp's energies without succumbing to corruption. They had believed themselves elevated above such crude vulnerabilities through discipline and knowledge that set them apart from lesser psychers. The truth was far more terrible. Their very gifts were the source of their damnation. Each use of psychic power adding layers of corruption that accumulated until the right conditions triggered catastrophic release. High above the carnage, Magnus felt each transformation as a personal wound, the agony of his sons tearing through his consciousness like shards of broken glass. He had held the flesh change at bay for centuries through sheer force of will, waging a silent war within his own mind against the genetic flaw that threatened to consume his legion. Now his fury at Russ, his grief for Prospero, had unleashed a tide of psychic power that shattered his careful control, and the price was being paid in the most horrific currency imaginable. As the curse continued its inexorable spread, Ahriman began formulating desperate measures that would one day become legend. The genesis of what would be known as the rubric of Ahriman took shape in his tormented mind as he watched his brothers die or transform into abominations. If the flesh was weak and prone to corruption, perhaps salvation lay in preserving the spirit while discarding the treacherous body entirely. The thought frightened him more than any demon, yet he clutched it like a sacred relic against the darkness closing around them. The battle for Prospero had become something far worse than conquest or even genocide. It was witnessing the death of hope itself. As warriors who had dedicated their lives to understanding the universe's mysteries discovered that some knowledge carried prices too terrible to pay, the city of light was transforming into a charnel house, where brotherhood died in explosions of mutating flesh and righteous fire, while above them their primarchs continued their titanic struggle, unaware that their conflict had awakened forces that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of corruption, sacrifice, and the thin line between salvation and damnation. The flesh change had awakened at last, and with it came the realization that the Thousand Suns' greatest enemy was not the space wolves or imperial judgment, but the very gifts that had made them what they were. In seeking to transcend mortal limitations through knowledge and psychic mastery, they had instead become prisoners of their own enhanced nature, trapped within bodies that could betray them at any moment. The curse would claim hundreds before the day was done, but its true victory lay not in the flesh it consumed, but in the hope it devoured, leaving only ash and bitter wisdom in its wake. The psychic shockwaves from the Primarch's titanic duel above sent tremors through Tizca's burning foundations, each collision of Frostblade against Crimson Will triggering fresh waves of mutation among the surviving Thousand Suns. Ahriman moved through the carnage like a scholar conducting the most important research of his existence, his enhanced senses cataloguing each transformation with methodical precision, even as his heart shattered with every brother lost to the flesh change. The chief librarian had witnessed isolated incidents before, studied them in controlled laboratory conditions, but to see the curse unleashed across his entire legion was to confront a horror that transcended academic understanding. Brother Captain Sobek writhed in the ruins of the philosophic archive, his power armor splitting at the seams as his enhanced physiology assumed dimensions that defied anatomical logic. The veteran's consciousness remained intact within the transforming shell, his eyes pleading for release from torment no mortal frame was meant to endure. Ahriman knelt beside his fallen comrade, pressing gentle hands upon ceramite that rippled like water, feeling the psychic emanations that accompanied each stage of mutation. "Peace, brother," Ahriman whispered, his voice carrying harmonics of sorrow and desperate purpose. "Your sacrifice will illuminate the path forward." The mercy bolt that followed was delivered with surgical precision, ending agony while preserving the psychic imprint that the chief librarian's enhanced consciousness absorbed and catalogued. Each death became a data point in the pattern he was beginning to perceive, building toward understanding that might yet save those who remained. The revelation struck him with the force of divine inspiration wrapped in mortal dread. The flesh change was not random mutation, but systematic corruption, following pathways carved into the Thousand Sons' genetic structure by the very gifts that had made them the Emperor's most learned legion. Their psychic abilities, the connection to the immaterium that allowed them to perceive truths beyond mortal comprehension, were inextricably linked to genetic instabilities that made them vulnerable to warp-spawned transformation. The stronger their psychic potential, the more susceptible they became to changes that belonged to realms where thought and flesh were one. "The body betrays us," Ahriman said to himself, voice low so the words would not feel like blasphemy against their genetic heritage. "The gene flaw feeds on our connection to the warp. Each time we reach into the immaterium, we provide fuel for our own corruption." The theoretical framework began taking shape with crystalline clarity, built upon centuries of study into consciousness and its relationship to physical form. Brother Sergeant Balek approached through smoke-filled corridors, his crimson armor scorched by flames that had consumed irreplaceable texts. The veteran's face bore strain that spoke of his own internal battle against the curse's early stages. "Chief Librarian," he reported, voice tight with controlled desperation. "We've lost contact with third and fifth companies. The transformation spreads faster than we can contain it." Ahriman felt time pressing against him like physical weight, each heartbeat representing another brother lost to mutation or enemy fire. How many remain unaffected? The question carried implications beyond tactical consideration, representing the scope of salvation he might yet achieve through methods that terrified him more than any demon. "Perhaps 300 scattered throughout the ruins," Balek replied, his enhanced senses detecting the psychic disturbances that marked fresh transformations across the city. "But the Sisters of Silence press closer. Their null fields accelerate the change rather than preventing it." The cruel irony was not lost on Ahriman. The very forces sent to suppress their psychic abilities were making the mutations worse, stripping away the careful mental disciplines that had kept the curse contained for over a century. If the flesh was weak and prone to corruption, perhaps salvation lay in preserving what truly mattered while discarding what could betray them. The spirit, the consciousness, the accumulated knowledge and wisdom that defined each warrior's essence could potentially be separated from the treacherous vessel that contained it. "Gather the survivors in the pyramid of Photep's lower levels," Ahriman commanded, authority born of desperate purpose hardening his voice. "Bring whatever texts survived the purging, particularly those dealing with consciousness transference and psychic preservation. We have work to do that will determine whether our legion survives this day with honor intact." As Balak moved to carry out these orders, Ahriman descended into the pyramid's deepest vaults, where forbidden texts had been stored behind layers of psychic wards and crystalline barriers. The irony was bitter beyond measure. To save his brothers from corruption, he would need to delve deeper into forbidden knowledge than any of them had dared before. The solution forming in his mind would require understanding forces that existed beyond approved imperial doctrine, demanding he become the very thing their accusers claimed he already was. The vault's ancient mechanisms recognized his psychic signature and granted access to chambers lined with texts that chronicled humanity's darkest experiments with consciousness and flesh. Here were treatises on soul binding, written by tech adepts who had pushed the boundaries of the Omnissiah's teachings, philosophical works exploring the nature of identity and existence, theoretical frameworks for separating mind from matter through ritualistic application of warp energies. Brother Anku Anen stumbled into the vault mouth, his armor bulging as the flesh change claimed him, despite his desperate resistance. Ahriman reached toward his transforming brother, not with hands, but with psychic senses that could perceive the pattern of corruption spreading through enhanced physiology. The mutation followed specific pathways, targeting the neural interfaces that connected consciousness to the immaterium, corrupting the very channels that made psychic ability possible. If I cannot trust the flesh to bear the soul's weight, Ahriman whispered to himself, then I must divorce the two entirely. The concept was monstrous, yet elegant in its simplicity. Preserve the consciousness while discarding the treacherous body that made it vulnerable to corruption. Bind the essential self to something that could not be twisted or changed, creating warriors who retained their knowledge and purpose while becoming immune to the curse that had plagued them since their creation. The rubric began taking shape in his mind as surviving battle brothers gathered in the vault's depths, their faces bearing mixture of hope and horror as they recognized the implications of what their chief librarian contemplated. Captain Caliphus arrived with a handful of warriors from the 6th Fellowship, while Brother Sergeant Menkara brought survivors from the outer districts where the Space Wolves' assault had been most brutal. Brothers, Ahriman addressed the assembled warriors, his voice carrying weight of absolute conviction wrapped in profound sorrow. The flesh change spreads through our ranks like wildfire, claiming more of our number with each passing moment. Our enemies use our gifts against us, turning our connection to the warp into the instrument of our destruction. But I have conceived a way to break this cycle, to preserve what makes us thousand suns while eliminating our vulnerability to corruption. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding and dread. These were scholars first, warriors second, men who could perceive the implications of consciousness separated from flesh with terrifying clarity. What Ahriman proposed was not salvation in any conventional sense, but transformation into something that existed between life and death, preserved in form but fundamentally altered in nature. The ritual will be complex beyond anything we have attempted, Ahriman continued, his enhanced mind already processing the theoretical frameworks required for such unprecedented sorcery. It will demand precision that leaves no room for error and power, drawn from sources that skirt the edge of damnation itself. Success will preserve our essential selves while making us immune to the curse. Failure will doom us to fates worse than simple death. High above them, Magnus felt his son's desperate planning through psychic bonds that connected all members of their legion. The Primarch's single eye blazed with mixture of pride and sorrow as he recognized the terrible nobility of Ahriman's purpose. His chief librarian was preparing to sacrifice his own soul to save what remained of their brotherhood, accepting potential damnation as the price of preserving something precious from Prospero's ruins. As the Space Wolves pressed deeper into the city and the flesh change claimed more victims, Ahriman began gathering components for the most ambitious sorceress working in human history. Ancient focusing crystals, psychically reactive metals, texts written in languages that predated human civilization. All the tools needed to attempt surgery upon the soul itself. The work was dangerous beyond measure, requiring exploration of realms where thought and reality intersected in ways mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. The seeds of the rubric were planted in soil watered by Brotherhood's blood, growing from love and desperation in equal measure. It would become legend and cautionary tale, testament to prices paid when salvation required embracing the very powers that had brought judgment. In the depths of a dying world, surrounded by the screams of mutating brothers and the roar of burning libraries, Ahriman began preparations for a ritual that would preserve the Thousand Sons as something between legend and nightmare, saved and damned by the devotion of a son who refused to let his legion fade quietly into history's darkness. The psychic screams of his dying sons tore through Magnus's consciousness, like shards of broken glass, each agonized cry adding another weight to the crushing burden of guilt that threatened to shatter his superhuman will. Brother Hathor Mart's final moments echoed through the immaterium as the flesh change claimed him, his scholarly mind dissolving into madness while space wolves pressed their assault through Tizca's burning streets. The Crimson King felt every transformation, every death, every moment of suffering as a personal wound that cut deeper than any blade his brother Russ could wield. The Wolf King's frost blade carved another burning line across Magnus's chest, the weapon's ancient power disrupting the psychic shields that had protected him throughout their titanic duel. Russ pressed his attack with methodical precision, each strike calculated to exploit weaknesses in his brother's defense while avoiding the dimensional traps that could turn physical force into warp energy. Around them, the Plaza of Remembrance had become a crater of shattered crystal and molten stone, monuments to their shared victories reduced to rubble by the fury of their conflict. "Yield, Magnus," Russ snarled, his amber eyes blazing with righteous conviction, even as they carried shadows of profound sorrow. "End this madness before I am forced to end you. Your sons die because of your arrogance. Your world burns because of your transgression. Submit to the Emperor's judgment, and perhaps some mercy can yet be found." Magnus staggered backward, crimson blood flowing like liquid fire from wounds that seemed to burn in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The accusation struck deeper than any physical blow, awakening the guilt he had tried to bury beneath layers of noble justification. "Mercy?" He laughed, the sound bitter as wormwood in his throat. "I sought to warn him of Horus's treachery and received condemnation. I tried to save the Imperium and destroyed his greatest work instead. What mercy exists for one whose love becomes the instrument of damnation?" Another devastating strike from Mjolnir sent Magnus to one knee, his psychic defenses flickering as exhaustion and despair combined to drain his vast reserves of power. In that moment of vulnerability, as his consciousness reeled from the impact, he felt presence stirring in the warp's depths. The entity that approached moved with patient confidence, ancient beyond mortal comprehension, yet focused with laser intensity upon this singular moment of opportunity. The voice that whispered through his mind carried harmonics of infinite possibility, wrapped in understanding that felt like balm upon wounded pride. "My dear Magnus," it purred, bypassing his ears entirely to resonate within his thoughts. "See how your nobility is rewarded. Your father's ingratitude, your brother's betrayal, your son's suffering, all payment for loyalty that was never truly valued." Magnus tried to shut out the voice, recognizing the source even as part of him yearned to listen. Zanch, the great changer, master of fate and architect of schemes that spanned millennia. He had felt this presence before during his deepest meditations, always pushing it away with disciplines learned through decades of study. Now, broken by defeat and watching his world burn, his resistance crumbled like walls before an inexorable tide. "I offer salvation," this entity continued, its words growing stronger as Magnus's defenses weakened. "Not just for you, but for your sons, who even now succumb to the curse you cannot cure. I can preserve them, transform their affliction into strength, make them something greater than mortals struggling against forces beyond their comprehension." Russ raised his blade for what might be the killing blow, frost crackling along its edge, as he prepared to end a brother he believed lost beyond redemption. The Wolf King's face was a mask of grim determination, duty overriding the bonds of blood that had once united them. Around them, the sounds of battle continued unabated, bolter fire echoing through burning streets, the screams of mutating warriors, the crash of falling masonry as Tizca's spires collapsed under systematic destruction. "What price?" Magnus whispered, the words barely audible above the chaos, yet carrying absolute clarity in the Immaterium's depths. He already knew the answer, had studied enough forbidden lore to understand that entities dwelling in the warp's depths never offered gifts without demanding payment that exceeded any possible benefit. Yet desperation made him listen. Love for his sons, overriding wisdom accumulated through decades of careful study. Tzeentch's response carried the weight of cosmic inevitability, patient as entropy itself. "No price that you have not already paid, my faithful student. Only acknowledgement of what you have become through your pursuit of knowledge. I offer completion of your education, transformation into something worthy of the truths you have glimpsed. Your sons will be preserved, their essence maintained while their flesh transcends mortal limitation." The vision that accompanied these words was both terrible and beautiful. His 1,000 sons standing transformed, their consciousness preserved while their bodies became vessels for power that dwarfed their current abilities. Ahriman's desperate ritual in the pyramid's depths would be rendered obsolete, replaced by metamorphosis that maintained their essential selves while eliminating vulnerability to corruption. It was salvation wrapped in damnation, preservation achieved through fundamental change. Magnus felt his resolve crumbling as the entity's offer resonated with every fear and hope that had driven him throughout his existence. To save his sons, to preserve something from Prospero's destruction, to prove that his pursuit of knowledge had meaning beyond the catastrophe it had apparently caused. The choice was no choice at all. His father had abandoned him. His brother sought his destruction. His sons were dying in agony while their world burned around them. "I accept," Magnus roared, the words tearing from his soul like confession extracted under torture. They echoed across both material and immaterial realms, sealing a bargain that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of loyalty and corruption. "Save them, transform them. I give myself willingly to preserve what matters most." The change began immediately, reality warping around Magnus as energies from realms where thought and matter were one flowed into his mortal frame. His single eye blazed with fires that belonged to no earthly furnace, while his physical form began swelling beyond the constraints of flesh and bone. Crimson skin rippled and stretched, growing to colossal proportions as great feathered wings tore through his power armor to cast shadows across dimensions. Russ recoiled in horror as his brother's transformation accelerated, the familiar features dissolving into something that belonged more to nightmare than nature. "Magnus," the Wolf King cried, his voice carrying mixture of rage and sorrow that spoke to bonds severed forever. What have you done? What have you become? The entity that had been Magnus the Red turned toward his brother, with eyes that held the depth of eternity, his voice carrying harmonics that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. I have become what was necessary, he replied, power radiating from his transformed frame in waves that made reality itself recoil. I have chosen preservation over pride, salvation over self. My sons will survive, whatever the cost to my own soul. The psychic shockwave that followed his transformation swept across Prospero's surface like a tide of change, touching every surviving thousand sun, with energies that would indeed preserve them through methods that transcended mortal understanding. In the pyramid's depths, Ahriman felt his gene father's sacrifice like a blade through his heart, recognizing that the path forward had been fundamentally altered by this act of desperate love. High above Tizca's burning spires, the newly ascended demon prince spread wings that cast shadows across reality itself, his transformed presence a monument to the prices paid when salvation required embracing the very powers that had brought judgment. The bargain was sealed, the transformation complete, and the thousand sons would indeed survive, though their preservation would prove to be another form of bondage, saved and damned by their father's love, made manifest in the most terrible way imaginable. The doom of Prospero had become something far worse than the destruction of a single world. It was the birth of tragedy that would echo through eternity, written in the transformation of noble purpose into instrument of chaos, brotherhood twisted into the very chains that would bind the thousand sons to powers that fed on hope's corruption, and the slow strangulation of everything they had once held sacred. The psychic shockwave unleashed by Magnus's transformation swept across Prospero's burning surface like a tide of fundamental change, each pulse carrying the weight of cosmic bargains and paternal sacrifice. In the great library's smoke-filled corridors, Ahriman felt his gene father's apotheosis as both liberation and damnation, the familiar psychic bond now carrying harmonics that belonged to realms beyond mortal comprehension. The Crimson King had chosen preservation over pride, salvation through methods that would echo across eternity, and the price of that choice was written in energies that made reality itself recoil, formed defensive positions around the central archive. Ahriman commanded, his voice carrying across vox channels that hummed with otherworldly interference. The chief librarian emerged from the pyramid's depths, bearing artifacts that pulsed with barely contained power, relics from humanity's darkest age that had been sealed away for reasons that were about to become terrifyingly clear. Around him, the surviving thousand sons moved with fluid precision, despite their dwindling numbers, crimson armor scorched black by flames that had consumed centuries of accumulated wisdom. Brother Captain Colophis marshaled his fellowship among towers of burning manuscripts, his enhanced senses detecting the approach of multiple space wolf packs through corridors where the greatest minds in human history had once walked. These were scholars first, warriors second, but they faced their final hour with dignity befitting the Emperor's chosen, even as their world crumbled around them and their father's transformation cast shadows across dimensions. The space wolves pressed their assault with methodical precision, their grey forms moving through smoke-filled passages like antibodies through infected tissue. Brother Sergeant Amlodi led his hunters past crystalline shelves where priceless texts fed hungry flames, his amber eyes scanning for targets among the crimson figures who defended knowledge they believed essential to humanity's future. The irony cut deep, destroying treasures that had taken millennia to gather, yet duty demanded compliance with orders that brooked no interpretation. Purge the heretical materials, Amlodi growled, raising his bolter toward philosophical treatises that had survived the initial bombardment. These texts are corrupted by their traffic with forbidden powers. The explosive rounds that followed sent fragments of ancient wisdom cascading through the air like snow, each piece a fragment of understanding that would never again illuminate human minds. Ahriman activated the first of his forbidden artifacts, a crystalline matrix sealed since the dark age of technology. The device resonated with harmonics that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating fields of temporal distortion that slowed the space wolves' advance to crawling pace. Within the affected area, bolt rounds hung suspended while chainswords moved with glacial slowness, their wielders trapped in moments that stretched toward eternity. "Sorcery!" Brother Sergeant Godric snarled, his voice carrying absolute conviction, wrapped in righteous fury. They prove their corruption with every breath. The accusation struck like physical blows, reducing decades of careful scholarship to mere heresy in dismissive phrases that spoke to faith unmoved by evidence or reason. The Sisters of Silence advanced through the chaos like personal winters, their null fields creating zones of psychic vacuum that made the temporal distortion warp in ways that belonged to nightmare rather than nature. Where their anti-psychic auras touched Ahriman's artifacts, reality folded like heated metal, time flowing backward and forward simultaneously as competing forces struggled for dominance over local space-time. Brother Captain Fodzis Takar made his stand at the chamber's heart, where the most precious texts had been gathered for final protection. The veteran's face bore the early signatures of the flesh change, mottled skin speaking to internal battles fought against genetic corruption. He raised his force sword with hands that trembled when they should not, meeting Ahriman's gaze with eyes that held humor, surviving worse than physical pain. "Your lines," Takar said, voice shaking with courage that transcended fear. "Buy them from me. I will keep the sellers busy." He turned without waiting for benediction. Neither would accept, taking position before the great doors, as space wolves poured through like grey tides seeking crimson shore. "Brothers," Ahriman spoke across all channels, his voice carrying mixture of love and sorrow that transcended tactical communication. "Our father has made his choice, paid the price for our preservation through means that will echo across eternity. We who remain must ensure his sacrifice has meaning." The battle that erupted was unlike any engagement the galaxy had witnessed during 2 centuries of conquest. Takar went down beneath chainsword and bolter fire, his form writhing as the flesh change claimed him in his final moments. Yet he rose again in shapes that defied anatomical logic, buying precious seconds with transformation's terrible gift. Kalophis led desperate countercharges against advancing wolves, his power fist crackling with disruptive energies that sent grey-armoured warriors sprawling among burning manuscripts. The temporal distortion field began failing, its crystalline matrix cracking under the strain of maintaining such fundamental alterations to reality's fabric. Ahriman felt time pressing against him like physical weight, each heartbeat representing another brother lost to mutation or enemy fire. The artifacts he carried were weapons of last resort, tools that demanded prices he was only beginning to comprehend. As the space wolves pressed deeper into the archive's heart, Ahriman made his final preparations. The ritual circles carved in the pyramid's depths pulsed with renewed purpose, no longer designed to cure the flesh change but to transcend it entirely. His gene father's bargain had altered the fundamental equation: preservation through transformation rather than cure through surgery. Hold fast to what makes us who we are, Ah, Ahriman commanded, activating the last of his forbidden devices. The air itself began to thicken with potential energy, reality warping as forces from realms where thought and matter were one responded to their master's desperate call. Let our final stand be remembered as worthy of the legion that bore the Crimson King's gene seed. The chamber's geometry inverted, angles becoming arguments that could not be refuted, as the library's deep heart opened with reluctant sigh to places that were not places. A wind that smelled of libraries burned, and oceans that had never known salt poured through dimensional tears, carrying the survivors toward preservation that would prove to be another form of bondage. Calophis made his last stand among memorial statues, his sword driven into crystal floors as he used it to stand against wounds that should have killed him hours ago. The veteran took one final step into Spear's reach and embraced his fate, both warrior and weapon falling together in gesture that had nothing of love and everything of meaning. As reality folded like paper around them, Ahriman closed his eyes, not to avoid seeing, but because going where they were going required surrender of sight itself. The City of Light groaned one last time, and something older than Prospero answered from beyond the tear in the sky, and the 1,000 voices of dying brothers became one note called away into darkness, where preservation awaited at prices yet to be calculated. The last defenders of knowledge had made their stand, and though they fell, their essence would endure through methods that transcended mortal understanding, saved and damned by love that refused to accept defeat even in the face of cosmic judgment. The dimensional rifts that had opened in Tizca's heart widened like wounds carved by cosmic blades, their edges bleeding energies that belonged to realms where reality was merely suggestion rather than law. Through these tears poured winds that carried scents of burning parchment and forgotten dreams, while the very air began to thicken with potential that made mortal minds recoil. The surviving 1,000 suns felt the pull of these portals like gravity made manifest, their enhanced consciousness perceiving the magnitude of change that awaited beyond the threshold of known space. Ahriman stood amid this cosmic upheaval, his crimson armor wreathed in energies that made reality itself weep. The chief librarian's enhanced senses detected the fundamental nature of what was occurring around them. This was not mere teleportation, but translation from one state of existence to another. The Eye of Terror, that great wound in reality, where chaos held dominion over natural order, was reaching out to claim them as its own. The demon prince that had been Magnus the Red spread wings across dimensions, his transformed presence serving as anchor and guide through the maelstrom. Where once stood their gene father now towered, something that belonged to myth rather than mortality, his single eye blazing with fires that had consumed restraint and mercy alike. Yet beneath the cosmic horror, familiar psychic resonances still carried the weight of paternal love, though that love had been transformed into something far more terrible and necessary. "My sons," Magnus spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. "Hold fast to what defines you." The translation comes. His words were both warning and benediction, a father's final guidance delivered as reality, prepared to reshape them according to laws that belong to nightmare rather than nature. The transition began with wrongness that escalated beyond comprehension. Gravity lost meaning as the survivors found themselves falling upward through dimensions that existed perpendicular to normal space. Time flowed backward and forward simultaneously, creating temporal eddies where past and future became indistinguishable from present moment. The very concept of location became fluid as they passed through regions where distance was measured in emotional resonance rather than physical separation. Brother Captain Kalophis felt his consciousness stretching between material realm and whatever lay beyond the tiers in space-time. The veteran warrior had dedicated his existence to understanding the universe's mysteries, but this transcended scholarship into direct experience of forces that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. Around him, his surviving battle brothers writhed as their enhanced physiology struggled to adapt to environments where the laws of physics were merely suggestions. The flesh change that had claimed so many of their brothers found new expression in this realm between realms, rather than the random mutations that had plagued them on Prospero's surface. The curse now followed patterns guided by will rather than chance. Warriors who had begun transforming discovered their metamorphosis, continuing along paths that preserved their essential selves, while granting capabilities that transcended mortal limitation. Ahriman felt his enhanced consciousness expanding beyond the constraints of his physical frame, awareness stretching across multiple dimensions as the eye's influence transformed perception itself. Through psychic senses that now operated according to laws he was only beginning to understand, he perceived their destination, a realm where preservation and damnation were indistinguishable, sanctuary that was also prison. The journey was a maelstrom of impossible sensations that stretched moments into eternities, while centuries passed in heartbeats. Light and shadow danced in patterns that defied comprehension, painting their vision with colors that had no names. The survivors clung to identity and purpose as anchors against dissolution, their enhanced minds struggling to maintain coherence in the face of pure, undiluted chaos. When the cosmic storm finally subsided, they found themselves standing upon ground that pulsed with unnatural radiance beneath a sky that bled aurora in spectrums beyond mortal perception. The air itself carried taste of ozone and ancient secrets, while the horizon shifted with geometries that hurt to perceive directly. This was the planet of sorcerers, a realm that had not existed until their need called it into being within the eye's perpetual tempest. Magnus descended through dimensions rather than air, his transformed presence casting shadows that followed rules belonging to dreams rather than physics. He stood before the remnants of his legion, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, wings furled against a sky that changed color with each thought. "You endure," he said simply, the words carrying weight of cosmic responsibility wrapped in paternal love. The survivors took inventory of their transformation. They remained themselves in all ways that mattered, yet had become something fundamentally different. Their consciousness was preserved, while their physical forms adapted to existence in realm where chaos held dominion over natural law. They were warriors of knowledge, transformed into beings that existed between dimensions, serving purposes that transcended their original understanding. Ahriman stepped forward with ritual precision, bowing not as one bows to a lord, but as one bows to theorem proven at terrible cost. "We endure," he replied, but altered. The price of preservation becomes clear. His words acknowledged both salvation and damnation, recognizing that their survival had carried them beyond humanity itself into realm where such distinctions became meaningless. The irony was bitter beyond measure. They had sought to preserve human learning against the galaxy's darkness, but their preservation had transformed them into something that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The thousand suns survived, their essential selves maintained, yet their salvation had become another form of bondage to forces that fed on hope's corruption and the slow strangulation of everything they had once held sacred. Around them, the eye's influence continued reshaping reality, according to patterns that belong to cosmic forces rather than natural law. Towers rose at distances that played tricks with scale, while rivers of light flowed without bed or margin, disappearing beneath horizons that migrated when observed. The world breathed them in and out, their lungs learning rhythms that frightened more than comforted. As night came like thought, abruptly, intimately, filling everything without announcement, the transformed warriors began the long work of understanding their new existence. They were preserved, yes, but as something between legend and nightmare, saved by sacrifice that would echo through eternity, as testament to prices paid when love demanded embracing darkness to preserve light. The doom of Prospero was complete, its survivors translated into realm where preservation and damnation were one, bound by devotion that had refused to accept defeat, even when victory required becoming the very thing they had once opposed. In the eye's depths, surrounded by architecture that followed rules of dreams rather than physics, the thousand suns began their eternal exile, forever changed by love that had destroyed what it sought to protect. The fires took days to die completely, their embers glowing like malevolent stars against Prospero's twilight sky, while ash fell in endless drifts that turned crimson armor grey and grey armor white, as if the world itself sought to blur the distinction between hunter and hunted. Where the city of light had once risen in crystalline splendor, now only twisted spires of fused glass remained, their surfaces reflecting twin suns that shone upon emptiness more profound than any darkness. The very air tasted of burned parchment and lost possibilities, each breath carrying fragments of knowledge that would never again illuminate human minds. Leman Russ walked through the ruins, with his helm mag-locked at his side, Frostblade hanging loose in a grip that had grown weary with the weight of duty performed without joy. The Wolf King's amber eyes surveyed what remained of his brother's domain, taking inventory of destruction that had exceeded every projection his strategists had prepared. In the Plaza of Remembrance, where monuments to shared victories had once stood as testament to fraternal bonds, only scorched pedestals remained, their inscriptions half melted into unreadable slag that spoke to the systematic murder of memory itself. Around him, space wolves moved with subdued efficiency that spoke to victory achieved at costs not yet calculated. Apothecaries marked their dead for retrieval, while pack leaders wove among shattered colonnades to ensure no pockets of resistance remained. Vox traffic was sparse, voices low even across encrypted channels, clipped reports folding into silence that pressed against their enhanced hearing like physical weight. They had fought with absolute certainty of righteousness, yet certainty now felt like chains forged from bitter metal. Brother Sergeant Amlodi approached through smoke that still rose from cooling ruins, his grey armor scored by energies that had transformed crimson-armored opponents into something beyond human understanding. "My lord," he reported, voice carrying weight of duty performed without question, "the city is secured. The contamination is contained." His eyes flicked toward a shape beneath collapsed gallery, a curled mass of fused ceramite, where 1,000 Suns warrior had undergone final transformation before merciful bolt round had ended suffering too terrible to endure. "Secured," Russ repeated, tasting the word as if it might admit different meaning. The distinction between victory and tragedy had become cliff edge with no visible bottom. Simple, justice transformed into something that cut deeper than any blade his brother could have wielded. Did you see it? At the end. The translation, my lord. Amlodi's voice held grave flatness that spoke to phenomena beyond conventional military terminology. Yes, we felt the boundary flex, The Primarch of the 15th is gone. The survivors of his legion are gone with him. Gone or taken. The distinction was stone in Russ's boot, simple duty transformed into cosmic tragedy through mechanisms he was only beginning to comprehend. Magnus had made his final choice, accepting damnation to preserve what remained of his sons through methods that belonged to realms where natural law held no dominion. The Crimson King had become something beyond brotherhood, beyond redemption, yet his love for his children had remained constant, even as it transformed into instrument of their mutual preservation and destruction. He climbed the broken steps of the Pyramid of Photep, each footfall echoing through chambers where his brother had once pursued knowledge with passion that had both impressed and irritated him in equal measure. Half-melted sigils lined walls, their meanings burned out of them, leaving only shapes of former purpose. A single meditation throne still stood amid slicks of vitrified floor, its crystalline surface cracked but unbroken, waiting for occupant who would never return. In the great library's collapsed chambers, recovery teams catalogued destruction with mechanical precision that spoke to protocols established for cleansing heretical materials. Each manuscript represented centuries of accumulated understanding, yet all were marked for incineration as potential sources of corruption. The philosophical treatises that had survived humanity's darkest age, the scientific observations that had mapped distant nebulae, the poetry that spoke of love and loss in languages predating human civilization, all reduced to ash that scattered in Prospero's thin atmosphere. The doubt that had gnawed at Russ throughout the campaign crystallized into sharp focus as he contemplated magnitude of what had been destroyed. The orders he had received spoke of Magnus as fallen to corruption, yet the brother he remembered had been loyal unto death, willing to risk everything to warn their father of approaching treachery. What if the accusations had been false? What if his desperate attempt to contact the Emperor had been misinterpreted as betrayal, rather than recognized as love expressed through forbidden means? Hours later, as shadows lengthened across crystalline wasteland, Malcador descended from grey sky in shuttle trailing dust like bridal veil. The sigillite emerged with hood back, face lined deeper than Russ remembered from terror, walking without haste as if urgency could no longer alter anything that truly mattered. He picked his way through rubble until he stood with the Wolf King on terrace that once had framed perfect view of Tizca's avenues. His work is destroyed, Malcador said. Not judgment, but simple fact that carried weight of cosmic inevitability. Russ kept his gaze on horizon, where smoke bled into dusk. Ours too. The orders, Malcador, Russ continued, meeting the ancient Psyker's gaze with amber eyes that held shadows of profound uncertainty. They were sharper than the Emperor's usual cut. The warp distorts, Malcador replied softly, words carrying weight of bitter experience. Words travel through storms. Hands reach from those storms with clever knives. The result is what lies around us. He gestured toward collapsed spires with small motion that encompassed tragedy beyond measure. We will learn which hands. For now, there is only consequence. When Malcador departed for Terra, where throne demanded feeding and wards required stitching, Russ remained among ruins that spoke to prices paid when duty became weapon, in hands of those who understood manipulation better than loyalty. The victory was complete, absolute, and utterly hollow. They had purged Prospero of corruption by destroying everything that had made it worth preserving. Far across dimensions that existed perpendicular to normal space, on world that had not been place until need called it into being within Ai's perpetual tempest, Ahriman walked along balcony that curved through itself according to geometries that hurt to perceive directly. The planet of sorcerers breathed around them with rhythms that frightened more than comforted, while sky above bruised from violet to black to colors that existed only in vocabularies of extinct species. Magnus descended through dimensions rather than air, transformed presence casting shadows that followed rules belonging to dreams rather than physics. "My son," he said, words containing galaxies of ache wrapped in paternal love that had survived transformation into something beyond mortal comprehension. "The price is paid." "We endure," Ahriman replied, bowing in way of proofs rather than submission, but altered. "We will learn to hold what we are, without hands. We will become lesson they will not read." His mind returned, as it had each hour, to diagrams abandoned in ash and half-born ritual that preservation had rendered obsolete through methods more terrible than any he had conceived. As night fell over Prospero's cooling surface, wind began long work of moving dust from one place to another, the only scholarship that could not be burned. No pilgrims would come to this place. No sanctioned text would name it more than footnote to edict, cautionary tale processed into single, sharp sentence that would echo through ages, as testament to prices paid when love demanded embracing darkness to preserve light. The galaxy spun, indifferent and attentive, while worlds went to sleep under skies that knew nothing of Prospero's fate. In places where oaths were kept, warriors checked edges on their blades and told themselves steel was enough. In places where oaths were broken, laughter sounded like doors closing on hope itself. The doom of Prospero was complete, its survivors translated into realm where preservation and damnation were one, bound by devotion that had refused to accept defeat, even when victory required becoming the very thing they had once opposed. The age of learning had ended in fire and blood, and shadows would never again be illuminated by gentle radiance that had once emanated from City of Light, leaving galaxy darker by degrees that could not be measured, but would be felt until stars themselves grew cold.